The Joyful Friar podcast is made possible by the generous support of our friends. To support the podcast, please visit nathan-castle.com and donate today.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm Father Nathan, your host. Today I'm doing the first of a two-part series on the stories of Jesus's birth. The Christian churches begin the season of Advent, which means coming. So for 4 weeks before Christmas, we're in this kind of waiting period that kind of parallels the waiting that is involved in pregnancy, waiting for something good to come, even if it comes through pain. It's part of what we do. And in the course of that, we have stories that are heard this time of the year, and of particular interest when we get all the way to Christmas, we hear the stories of how Jesus is actually born. There are two of them. Out of the four Gospels, two of the Gospels begin with Jesus as a young man and don't reference his birth at all. But there are two, Matthew and Luke, that do that. Now, I'm trying to do this podcast for people that have never done Bible study, and I think of it more in terms of comparative religion. I didn't know very much about Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam until I took a course in comparative religion in college, and then a smattering of reading that I've done along the way. But I do enjoy hearing stories from other people's traditions, and that's kind of the way in which I'm approaching this today. Just so and it doesn't really matter who you are or where you come from, but you just might find some of this interesting, and it'd make you a little better rounded person, more fun at a party. How about that? Well, of the two Gospels that do have a story of Jesus, of Jesus's birth, they don't agree on a lot of the details, and we should talk about that right away. Remember that Jesus, at the time of his birth, was a peasant child of peasant parents. There was nobody going around with a camera or a notepad at the time of Jesus's birth wanting to report on it because it was so notable, because in fact it wasn't. He was just another little kid being born somewhere. The stories that Jesus's birth would have been somewhere around the beginning of the first century, not exactly the year zero because there are different calendar discrepancies, but that's Christians eventually in the West got to set the calendar by what they thought was the most important event in it, like how to keep track of time. Well, let's do it since the birth of the Christ, of Jesus. Remember, we keep track of the years from what we think is the most important thing that's happened in time, and Christians got to make that determination and set the calendar to begin at about the time of Jesus's birth, roughly 2023 years ago. There's discrepancies in the calendars as they move through time, and none of these dates are absolutely precise, but they're rough figures. So Jesus is born somewhere between 5 BC or 7 AD, somewhere in there, however you want to think about it. And he lives what we think might be into his early 30s. So the events of his death and resurrection are happening in the early 30s. The stories that we have that I'll be talking about date from the mid to late 80s. The principal characters whose life stories are inside the story are mostly dying off, and there begins to be some sense that we need to get this down before all the principal characters are not with us. Very much the way that you might have done that in your family with grandma's recipes, or making some of the elders talk into a video or something, so their stories will be with us later. Well, anyway, Matthew does have a story, and that's the one I'm going to focus on today. In the next episode, I'll focus on the story of Jesus's birth as is told in Luke. One of the things that they both have to contend with is that in his public life, Jesus was often known as Jesus of Nazareth. Well, that presumes that he is born in, or at least from, the town of Nazareth. So they both have to end up explaining that in the story. But there's also a prophetic tradition in Judaism that the one who will be the Messiah, the anointed one of God, will be born in Bethlehem of Judea. And so both authors are having to figure out, how did this baby born in Bethlehem become Jesus of Nazareth? So there must be some sort of movement. That can't be true. There must be lots of people in this audience who were born somewhere else than where they're now living. There's just nothing uncommon about that. But that's at least a factor. And then these things are not really written to be like page one of a newspaper. Do you remember learning how to read a newspaper? I remember somewhere around third grade, we had to bring newspapers in from home, and we were taught how to distinguish between the claims made on page one and those made in the advertisements. We had to look at the comics and ask ourselves, can dogs really talk? The advice column, the obituaries. There's lots of different kinds of genres inside of a daily newspaper. And that's true of the Bible. It's really more of a library than a book. There's lots of different kinds of literature inside it, the way that you would expect to go into a library and find a great variety of kinds of writing within it. With that said, these stories are also to inspire faith and to evoke a sense of belonging to a larger story. So it's not just writing down biographical details, it's helping the reader feel like they belong in this story and that it's a part of them. That's important. Recall, too, that most people in the ancient world didn't know how to read. So if you're the writer, how do you craft a story in writing and have it received by a largely illiterate audience? Let that soak in for a second. How do you put something in writing for a person who can't read? Well, obviously, it would have to be read by somebody who does know how to read, and the story is told to others who don't know how. Another thing is that the printing press is still 1,500 years off. What does get put in writing gets put down because somebody wrote it down by hand on papyrus, rolled up into scrolls. If you wanted to own a copy of it, that would only make sense if you could read it. But if you wanted to own your own copy, you would have to pay the labor of a scribe who labored to write down every last word in their own handwriting. Imagine the labor costs associated with that. So these texts were not lying all over the place. I mean, how much printed material have you seen already today? Stuff that came in the mail, or I'm surrounded by books. The printing is just all over the place. Well, that just wasn't at all the case in the ancient world. So if you're a writer, you have to think of, how can I tell this story in a way that once the listener hears it, they'll remember it, because they don't have recourse to reading it again. Maybe the story will be told repeatedly, which would make it easier to remember, but that's on the writer to write the story in such a way as to help people remember it. Well, in the Gospel of Matthew that we're going to look at today, one of the ways to tell a new story is to tell it in the form of an old story that people already know. Let that soak in for a second. There are some stories that people already know. All you have to do is remind them of some detail, and they're back there. They can remember when they took that story in. Of course, for us, we also have cinema. So some of the stories that we get are coming to us through film. But in the ancient world, all of it was an oral tradition, somebody's storytelling, often around a campfire. But anyway, if there are some stories that almost everybody in our clan knows that's a good place to start. It's the superstructure that you can impose another story on top of, and people will remember it better. It's also a way to take a newer story and connect it with the old story to show continuity, that the new story isn't just a brand new thing out of thin air. The new story resembles the old story because the same creative force is in motion over time and space. So today, what we're going to look at is a story that's in the book of Genesis, which is in the Old Testament. It starts in the 37th chapter, and I hope it doesn't creep you out when I start using chapter and verse numbers. It sounds so churchy. They're just wonderful stories, and there's one of them that's a long story. It goes for about 13 chapters. It's the story of Joseph. If you're a theater person, you might recognize the play Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. It's that Old Testament character. So I've just spent a couple of hours going back over that story to have it fresh in my mind, but there are some things about it that that if maybe you even know this story already, and in that case, I'm refreshing your memory, but there might be some for whom it's a brand new story. There are several elements in it. There's the central character is named Joseph. He is he's the son of his father Jacob, Israel, and he's the child of his father's old age. He's particularly beloved of his father, even though the father has a dozen sons. Joseph is particularly beloved. Think of this story in Matthew's gospel. It's primarily about Jesus, even though he hasn't been born yet. He's going to, a lot of these details from the Old Testament Joseph story are going to move through Joseph, the father of Jesus, who has dreams. The character in the Old Testament Joseph story has the gift of dreams. God communicates to him through dreams. I particularly like that because that's been a feature of my spiritual life for a long time. But there's this beloved child, and apparently in the story, his father shows him such favoritism as to inspire the anger of his brothers toward him. They're shepherds, and at one point they decide, let's get rid of him, and they plot to kill him. Well, remember, that's going to happen in the life of Jesus much later in the Gospel of Matthew. His own are going to turn on him. His own brothers are going to betray him. They decide to do it out when they're out tending their flocks, and they come upon a cistern, a well. This one happened to be dry, but it was a deep hole in the ground, and they decide, let's just toss him in there. Well, so now you've got this Joseph character in a hole in the ground, left for dead. Well, Jesus is later going to be put in a tomb, a hole in the ground, where he's left for dead. It's that kind of thing. You see where this is going? The Hebrew word for it is midrash, taking an existing story and putting a new story on the same framework to make it more easy to remember. Well, one of his brothers decides, he tries to have mercy and not let his brother be killed, and he tries to secretly get him out of there. He makes a plan to do that, but before he can do it, a caravan of travelers comes by, and one of his brothers says, why not get something of value for him? Let's sell him to these people that are passing through. So he gets sold for 20 silver pieces. In Jesus's case later, it's going to be 30 silver pieces, but you see the correlation that's going on. The thing that happened long ago is happening again in this newer story. Joseph is taken out of the cistern, out of the hole in the ground, and he's brought off into Egypt as a slave. Egypt is going to have a part in the story of the infant Jesus in Matthew's gospel, they're going to have to run to Egypt to get to safety because King Herod is killing all the children, the newborn boys. He goes into Egypt, finds favor with the chief steward of Pharaoh's household, and ends up employed in the household, fed well and treated as a member of the royal household. Royalty is somehow attached to the person of Jesus, certainly not by direct lineage of Mary and Joseph, but there's a quality of kingship about him that's sort of mirrored in the way that Joseph isn't exactly Pharaoh's child either, but he shows up and is accepted into the royal household. He has a big problem in that Pharaoh's, I think it's his boss's wife makes it sexual advances towards him that he keeps rejecting, and eventually it angers her. She has him kind of cornered in her private quarters. He refuses her advances, screams, he runs out and leaves his cloak behind. That little detail turns up in the Garden of Olives or Gethsemane in Mark's gospel. Anyway, there's all these little connections like that. But he ends up in jail. But in jail, he meets a couple of other people that work in the household that have fallen out of favor. They each have dreams that he interprets successfully. One of them that he will survive, and the other one that he'll be killed. The surviving one gets back in the good graces of his employers and is back in the royal household when the Pharaoh himself has a couple of perplexing dreams and speaks of them out loud. His servant says, you know what, there's this person in your own household who God has given this gift to interpret dreams. Why don't you ask Joseph? He's really good at this. It turns out that the dreams that Pharaoh had, one of them was he was dreaming he was next to the Nile, and out of it came 5 fat cows who are obviously very well fed. And then there came 5 skinny ones out of the east with a dark east wind blowing, and the skinny ones ate the fat ones. He had a similar dream of I think it was stalks of corn, 7 of them that were fully abundant, loads and loads of corn, and then 7 of them that were all wilted and shriveled. Well, Pharaoh told these stories in the presence of Joseph, and Joseph said, this isn't me. God has just given me this gift, but I can tell you what those dreams are foreshadowing. God's trying to prepare you and warn you in advance that they're going to be 7 years of great plenty, abundant crops, but afterwards there's going to be 7 years of famine. So get ready. Be sure that at the time that your crops are super abundant, that you're storing away food for the bad times, for the years of famine. Pharaoh thought that was marvelous, kind of promoted him even more. But then there you have this story of someone who is preparing ahead so that his people might be fed. In the gospel stories, Jesus is going to several times be in circumstances where someone says, there's too many people here and there's not enough food. What are we going to do? And Jesus becomes known for multiplication of food, and people get used to there being abundance of whatever they need when Jesus is around. So it's again a part of that tradition. During the famine years, his brothers have gone back to Canaan where they live, but they've heard that over in Egypt there's abundant food, and so they travel there trying to buy food. They get to the Pharaoh's household and explain themselves, and they don't recognize their brother Joseph, whom they had given up for dead, and they talk in his presence in their own indigenous language that they presumed he wouldn't understand, but he's listening all the while. And they're lamenting the fact that they had taken the life of their brother, or at least sold him into slavery. There's several chapters of drama going back and forth about that, but the point that's important for Matthew in his gospel is that that out of that place of slavery, for those of you who are Jewish, that's where the Passover story comes from, is coming God's action moving people out of slavery to freedom. And in Matthew's story, it's going to go in the opposite direction. Jesus is going to have, and his family are going to have to flee to Egypt and then come back out of Egypt to the land. But it's that connection of that geographical movement and abundance, abundant feeding, and God's action being a part of the good times and the bad times. So that's enough of those connections. But the reason that Matthew chooses to tell the story of Jesus's birth through the point of view of Joseph, in the Catholic tradition, he's called foster father of Jesus, because God the Father, the Holy Spirit, are the divine father. Joseph is the adoptive father, foster father in our tradition. But anyway, you've got all of that going on. Okay, you still with me? I'm going to move now to the text itself of Matthew, and it couldn't be any more boring. Honest to God. It starts with a long genealogy of what are very difficult to pronounce names. It's not the way that any contemporary writer would start a story, but it starts like this: a family record of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Well, he's going all the way back to Abraham, who is, and in our times of increasing division and violence, the Abrahamic faiths are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All of them trace their roots back to the common ancestry of Abraham. It's good to try to remember that. We have an ancestry that, yes, it does include a lot of fighting and violence of one religious group against another over time, but it also reminds us that we have common parentage. Well, anyway, Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And then it starts into this long list of what are sometimes called begats. So-and-so begat this one. This one was the father of this one. This one was the father of that one. And they're bundled in a kind of rhythmic, like metronomic kind of way. Tick, 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 tick. This one was the father of that one. This one was the father of that one. This one was the father of that. And then anytime that the rhythm is broken in this thing, it involves a woman. And most of the time it's a patriarchy, but it's talking of men, and then there'll be women who are thrown into the mix. And they're grouped in 14 generations. There are 3 groups of 14. Here's an interesting thing. For example, what would 14 be in a Roman numeral? X is 10, and IV would make it 14. See that? So we learned somewhere, probably in elementary school, that for the Romans, letters can be used to be both the component parts of a word or of a number. Well, Hebrew worked similarly, except in Hebrew, the word for David, with the number DVD, I don't know, I can't do the Hebrew for you, but you remember, Hebrew doesn't have vowels, it has only consonants, and it has little things that look like squiggles to someone that doesn't know Hebrew that tells you how to pronounce them, what vowel sounds to put between the consonants. So DVD, it would be the way to spell David, but it would also be 464, which adds up to 14. 4 plus 6 plus 4 is 14. So the name David is also the word, the way to write the numeral 14. And the author, rather than think of every last relative, why would we need to know every last relative? But he's grouped them kind of into shorthand form into groups of 14, to remind us that the person who is being described in this genealogy, his ancestry, is Davidic. And for the Jews, the Messiah was going to be born of the house of David. That was part of a prerequisite. If you were going to be considered possible Messiah, you at least needed to be from the line of David. So Matthew organizes this genealogy, and near the end of it, it says, so the total, it says, Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. It was of her that Jesus, who is called the Messiah, was born. Thus, the total number of generations is from Abraham to David, 14 generations. From David to the Babylonian captivity, 14 generations. From the Babylonian captivity to the Messiah, 14 generations. So that's the first 17 verses of the first chapter of Matthew's gospel. It's just this genealogy, and that's what it's trying to accomplish. It's telling you that Jesus is from the line of David, and then every time that there's a break in the meter of the way the story of the genealogy moves, there's some woman who's part of this godly movement, but her story involves some sort of scandal, hint of scandal, something about sexuality. And of course, in this story, we're going to learn that Mary conceives this child in an unusual way. So the author is saying this is not the first time that some unusual thing has been part of God's plan, that someone arrives here in a way that seemed to others to be irregular or scandalous even. But here, now we're at verse 18. This is how the birth of Jesus Christ came about. When his mother Mary was engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found with child through the power of the Holy Spirit. Joseph, her husband, an upright man, unwilling to expose her to the law, decided to divorce her quietly. That was his intention when suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. So Joseph is asleep in the scene, and if you were doing it in cinema, you would have to figure out a way to get us inside Joseph's imagination, into his dreaming. So would you put an angel with big wings? Would you move the whole scene into some sort of thought bubble, into some mistiness, during which a wind or a light or something kind of ethereal tells him this message? Joseph, son of David, have no fear about taking Mary as your wife. It's by the Holy Spirit that she has conceived. She's also to have a son, and you are to name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. And then Matthew is very big on rooting his story in Old Testament prophecy. By the time this story is in finished form in the late 80s, much of the community that's receiving it no longer knows how to speak Hebrew. The temple was torn down in the year 70. Many of the people who began to be part of what was the early Christian church had not been Jewish. They didn't know Hebrew. They didn't eat kosher. They didn't have memories of going to the temple. Many of them were Gentile, and they were from other places besides Israel. So what Matthew is trying to do is show them that yours is not a fly-by-night religion of the month. It's connected with all that God has been doing, moving through time. And so one of the ways he will do that is by quoting an Old Testament prophet. He quotes, "The virgin shall be with child and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, a name which means God is with us." Joseph awoke and did as the angel of the Lord had directed him. He received her into his home as his wife. He had no relations with her at any time before she bore a son, whom he named Jesus. All right. The name Emmanuel, it's a funny thing because the angel says, name him Emmanuel, and then 2 sentences later, they're naming him Jesus. But they bring the definitions in that his name will mean God is with us. And that's interesting because if you remember the Moses story, Moses was tending his flocks, minding his own business. This burning bush crosses his field of vision. He walks up toward it. He's told to go no further, remove your shoes, you're on holy ground. He ends up getting a mission from a voice coming out of this burning bush. I want you to go to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to set my people free. Moses says to him, well, you got to tell me your name. They're going to want to know on whose authority am I doing all this. And he said, tell them I am. And in fact, it's the infinitive form. That is, it's without time. So it's not only I am who am, I was who was, I am who am, I will be who will be. Am, beingness, I am. Well, this baby is going to be called Emmanuel, which means I am with you. All right, that's important. It's going to show up all the way at the end of Matthew's gospel, where Jesus is already going to be risen from the dead. He's going to gather his 11 disciples because one has betrayed, and he gets with the 11 as the risen version of himself, says, go out to all the nations, tell the good news, do all the things that you've seen me do, and know that I am with you always until the end. And as a believer, that's something I take very seriously, and that's a comfort to me that I'm never alone, because I am is with me. That God, the I am, created all that is, including me, and I'm inside God's creation and inside what I think of as the body of God, the universe. So Joseph wakes up from his dream, and the baby's born. Now, the next set of characters, and this is going to go pretty quickly. The short story is not long. I just had to spend a little time developing some themes ahead of it. But it says, after Jesus's birth in Bethlehem of Judea, during the reign of King Herod, the version I'm reading from says astrologers from the east. Sometimes it says magi from the east, from which we get the word magic. You might find a translation somewhere that says king, but it's really not very accurate. Magi or astrologer, I think, are pretty closer to the mark. Anyway, they come from the east and they arrive in Jerusalem asking, where's the newborn king of the Jews? We observed his star at its rising, and we've come to pay him homage. Well, if you're setting up your crib set, or if you're not a Christian, but you've driven through a neighborhood where Christians live in the weeks running up to Christmas, you might see lit figures on the lawn of something that looks like a barn with hay, cattle, sheep, shepherds, angels, and then maybe they're there at the beginning, 3 kings on camels bringing gifts. Sometimes they don't show up until later in the story for people that want to add that dramatic piece a little later. When I was growing up, when we set up our nativity set in early December, it might be under the tree, but the wise men were on the piano, or they were all the way across the room. And when we were children, we would make them move a little closer to the creche until they got there at Christmas. Well, anyway, in this story, there are no shepherds, there are no large crowds of angels. There's just an angel that comes to talk to Joseph in a dream. And there's no barn, there's no farm animals, because he's born in a house. In Matthew's version of the story, they appear to live in Bethlehem and have a house like other people do, and Jesus is born in a house. The reason that they have to flee Bethlehem comes in this second chapter. These guys show up from the east inquiring about him, and they go to King Herod, like royalty to royalty, and they ask where he's going to be, where his successor is going to be. And Herod asks his own courtiers. He said, these guys want to know from me where the newborn king is going to be born. What do your scriptures say? And they said, here's what the prophet has written. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the princes of Judah, since from you shall arise a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel. So if there are any of you that live in places or are from places that most people have never heard of, take heart. Jesus was born in just such a place. Bethlehem was a place hardly anybody had ever heard of until Jesus made it famous by being born there. I'm from Groves, Texas. I'm always having to explain that it's next to Port Arthur and a little bit south of Beaumont. If that doesn't mean anything to you, you're not from Texas. But I can keep going. I can say, well, it's 90 miles east of Houston. Now most people would recognize that. Anyway, Jesus is from this place that prophets have said the Messiah would come from. His family appears to live there already, but they're going to have to run away because the astrologers, Herod takes them aside and says, go and get me information. He's trying to turn these well-intentioned gift givers into spies. Go get me information about the child and come back and tell me where he is so that I can go and offer my homage too. Well, as children's stories very often have a villain in them. And it was quite clear that King Herod was villainous in this story and appearing to want to go know more about this child. Anyway, after their audience with the king, the Magi set out. The star which they had observed at its rising went ahead of them until it came to a standstill over the place where the child was. Well, that's quite grand. But Matthew is saying this person is not just of interest to some little in-group. The very skies are announcing his presence. That's the point of what the star is doing. Well, they were overjoyed at seeing the star, and entering the house, they found the child with Mary, his mother. They prostrated themselves and did him homage. And then it says they opened their presents. They opened their coffers and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. By the way, the story didn't tell us how many magi there were. It only said there were magi from the east. 3 comes in because they brought 3 different kinds of gifts. Now, did each one of them bring only one kind of gift? Were there 10 magi who brought 3 gifts? The story doesn't care. But the way it's come down traditionally is that there are 3 kings who are bringing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The way that that's usually been understood is that gold is symbolic of royalty, in this case, divinity, the greatest, purest, richest thing, of kingship more than divinity. You would expect to find gold in palaces of a king. Frankincense, that would involve incense is used in lots of different worship forms. In fact, some of you might have a practice even in your home prayer space of burning some incense just to set a mood. I sometimes recommend that to people when they're developing a prayer practice. It's one of the ways, sensory ways of lighting a candle, for example, is another one. But burning incense and sometimes watching it ascend. If you're imagining God to be up, or watching it diffuse through the space, if you're thinking of the Spirit of God being, infused through a space. Incense is used in forms of worship and prayer. And this baby is going to be attached to worship and prayer. And the last one is myrrh, which is a very unusual thing to bring to a baby's birthday party. It's an embalming element. It was used at funerals. It was expensive and rare, but it also brings a kind of shadow to the story that this baby is also going to be, his story is going to be attached to the manner of his death. So that's a lot to pack into one little story. It continues. After they had left, the angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph again. So we're back to does the angel have wings? And does it look, or is it in a hazy dream fashion. Anyway, Joseph hears the dream, he hears the message, and is told, get up, take the child and his mother, and flee into Egypt. Stay there until I tell you otherwise. Herod is searching for the child to destroy him. So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother and left that night for Egypt. He stayed there until the death of Herod, to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I will call my son. I think I've read somewhere that was according to we have good information in the ancient world about the reigns of different important people, because they had paid historians that wrote this stuff down. It might have been that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph stayed in Egypt for about 4 years before it was safe to come back. Once Herod realized that he'd been deceived by the astrologers, he was furious. He ordered the massacre of all the boys 2 years and under in Bethlehem and its environs, making his calculations on the basis of what he had learned through the astrologers. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A cry was heard at Ramah, sobbing and loud lamentation, Rachel bewailing her children. No comfort for her, since they are no more. In our calendar, there's a feast called the Holy Innocents that's celebrated on December the 28th, only a few days after Christmas. After Herod's death, the angel of the Lord appears again to Joseph in Egypt, and this time says, get up, take the child and his mother, set out for the land of Israel. Those who had designs on the life of the child are dead. So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and returned to the land of Israel. He heard, however, that Archelaus had succeeded his father Herod as king of Judea, and was afraid to go back there. Instead, Joseph went further north to the land of Galilee. There he settled into a town named Nazareth. In this way, what was said through the prophets was fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. So that's how Matthew solves that problem. So again, if you're setting up your crib set, you don't need a lot. You don't need anything that looks like a barn. You don't need any farm animals, because they live in a house. What you need is Mary, Joseph, and the baby, and maybe some angel form. Maybe it is an angel that whispers in your ear. Maybe he looks like this. But those would be the only figurines that you would need. All those shepherds and sheep and cattle and all of that, that's for the next story. What you would need is the Magi, or if we want to call them three kings, go ahead. They would need to be there because they show up in the story. And in fact, for most of chapter 2, they carry the plot. So Mary, Joseph, Jesus, Magi, you're good to go. So I'm grateful if you stayed with me. This might not be of interest to a lot of people in my audience, because people tune into the Joyful Friar for different reasons. And this one doesn't have particularly to do with afterlife stories that I tell a lot of the time. But I do think it's good for us to be literate in each other's religious traditions to a point. And whether you're a Christian who celebrates Christmas, or maybe you celebrate Christmas without practicing a particular spiritual Christian faith, I thought you might want to know this stuff. So that's why I'm sharing it with you. Next week's podcast will be similar, maybe a little bit shorter, because I won't have to explain everything quite as much as I did this time. But next time it'll be from the Gospel of Luke. And his is charming. His story is charming in a different way. That one does involve the no room at the inn stories, the being born in a barn or a cave. That's where the animals come in. Shepherds are a figure in it, and a whole, not just one angel, but like a whole sky full show up to tell these shepherds, quick, go run over there. There's something you got to see. All of that will be for next time. So for right now, I want to say thank you for joining me. Remember that I always pray for you, members of my audience. I'm grateful that you give me the gift of your time, and I feel like I owe you a little something. So I'm always praying for you. But for now, I'm Father Nathan Castle. This has been the Joyful Friar podcast. Thanks for being with me. God bless you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Joyful Friar. Please like, follow, and subscribe. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. God bless.